Funding for Working Lunch is provided by the financial contributions of viewers like you. Additional funding is provided by First Bank, McGuire Woods Consulting, and Fidelity Investments.
Coming up next, a great conversation with North Carolina business leaders about public policy and politics and why they're actively involved. So pull up a chair and join us for Working Lunch.
Working Lunch is a production of UNC TV in association with the North Carolina Free Enterprise Foundation.
Well, Bob, tell us about your company.
I founded Captive Air in Raleigh 40 years ago with virtually no money. We're now the leading manufacturer of commercial kitchen ventilation systems in the U.S. 1,100 employees, 6 factories, and 80 sales offices.
Wow, impressive. Algernon, tell us about your company.
Yeah, I started Wharton Gladden & Company about 13 years ago. We are a boutique investment banking firm. We've spent the majority of that time focused on real estate transactions, so apartments, office buildings, shopping centers. And here in the last 2 or 3 years, we've went more into the restaurant and hospitality space, so very familiar with Captive Air. So.
Great, and Richard, in fairness and full disclosure, your company is one of the sponsors of this program, but tell us a little bit about the bank you run.
We're very glad to sponsor this program. I'm part of First Bank. First Bank is an 85-year-old North Carolina institution. We currently have, well, when we close on our acquisition of Carolina Bank in Greensboro, we'll be a $4 billion plus institution with right around 1,000 employees with over 90 branches, most of them from mountains to the coast in North Carolina, but a handful in South Carolina as well.
And Garland, tell us about your business and a little bit what you've done in your recreational time.
Okay. Well, the business first. Triangle Capital, I founded about 15 years ago, and it started as a private equity fund, and in 2007 we converted it from a fund to a corporate structure, took it public. We now, and basically as a company, we invest in other companies. It's technically called a business development company, but nobody ever knows what that term means. We've got roughly 90 investments all around the U.S. in small, lower middle market companies. Our market cap is about $800 million. We're traded on the New York Stock Exchange and based here in Raleigh. My recreational activities, let me say I'm happy that I had a way to earn my living rather than writing and selling books, but I've been a history buff for a long time and have written 2 books in the last 5 or 6 years. One on the 1924 presidential election and the other one on 14 American leaders called Conservative Heroes.
And so in that work, you've talked about people that have been involved in politics and people that have seen the connection between public policies and the bottom line profitability of business. What is it you've learned in doing the research for your books that informs why business leaders should be engaged?
Well, I guess starting from what I've seen personally in business, looking at our 90 or so investments all around the country and probably 30 different industries, there's not a single industry or a single one of our investments that doesn't wrestle regularly with how to comply with government regulation. It's just become a big part of life. And looking at the sort of the political scene in the second book I wrote, 14 Leaders, I mean, it was interesting. The leaders that I picked to profile started with Jefferson and Madison at the beginning of the Republic, and government regulation wasn't too much of a deal until you got to the late 19th century, but as we went through the 20th century, it became more and more of a function of government to regulate business. And I would say now that business leaders really can't afford to ignore government regulation. Certainly can't afford to ignore government regulation, and they need to be involved in how it's formulated and what those new regulations are going to be.
Algernon, you've been very actively involved in discussions about energy-related issues, traveling all across the country and across North Carolina. What makes you interested in talking about that as a public policy?
Well, I got involved in energy about 7 years ago, back when we still had the moratorium on hydraulic fracturing here in North Carolina. And if you could remember what was going on 6 or 7 years ago here in North Carolina, we were going through a pretty tragic recession. We were number 5 in terms of unemployment in the country. And personally, I just started looking around to figure out what was going to be that catalyst that was going to be able to not only move the country forward, but more specifically be able to move North Carolina forward. You know, we harken back to the days of the 90s, and it was technology and sort of the drivers that we had around technology. And so I just found energy and just thought that energy was something that could really jumpstart not only the U.S. economy, but certainly the North Carolina economy, and not specifically just hydraulic fracturing, although we did work on that issue for many years and got the moratorium lifted, and now North Carolina is in the energy business. But the larger opportunity here in North Carolina is offshore energy, and just the ability to create somewhere around 50 or 55,000 jobs right here in our state, if we can get the federal government to reduce regulations and allow us to compete in that space.
So Bob, in your industry, high rates of regulation as well. What are some of the challenges you face?
Well, government's regulating everything we do, from our employees. The federal government now wants to regulate just simple restaurant fans. If you think about it, you have an industry that's tremendously competitive. They're fighting day in and day out to produce a better product, and the federal government's going to come in knowing nothing about fans, and they're going to regulate it. So if you don't do something about it, pretty soon your hands are tied. So now you have a concept of exit, and if you look at companies like Uber, they're essentially bypassing the whole system because the regulation is so insane and so onerous that you can't really exist in a competitive market.
Banking very lightly regulated as an industry.
Well, actually, banking should be regulated because we get our raw materials, our deposits are guaranteed by every family in this country, and so we should be regulated, and we should accept that. The problem with regulation is, you know, it's one of the things that tends to put people into different camps, whether they view themselves as a liberal or conservative. Most liberals believe that we need regulation, that big business left to itself, capitalism is all about the big getting bigger and doing whatever it needs to make a living. Conservatives tend to be on the other side, that no, we don't need virtually any regulation at all. The most of the problems are in the middle with regulation that does not work. And you can't find one person with any common sense in the example that Bob just gave that, well, okay, let's don't debate about whether we need to regulate fans or not, but does the regulation work? And when it doesn't work, there doesn't seem to be any political will or any organized place to go say it doesn't work, because if a business leader says it doesn't work, oh, that's just a fat cat who wants to make more money. And then you take the other side of the issue, well, no, that is protecting workers. We must keep it in place. When you get right down to it, if you run a business and you provide jobs, you need for the lane that you run in to be as efficient and productive for all concerned. And all too often, that just doesn't happen today. It's pretty frustrating.
Well, Algernon, in the investments that you look at, do you see companies struggling to try to overcome the burden that they face from regulations that aren't working?
Yeah, and I agree with Mr. Moore. I think you do need some level of regulations.
Please
you do
call me
need.
Richard.
Okay, yeah. I agree with Richard. I do think you need some level of regulation, national standards. I mean, you take energy, for example. There needs to be regulations. I mean, there need to be controls that do not allow large oil and gas companies to run roughshod over public land and public property and just ordinary people. However, my argument in that situation always is those regulations need to be smart and at least sensible. And a lot of times that's what I see happen, not only in the energy industry but also in the investment industry. You take something like Dodd-Frank. Dodd-Frank is a 2,000+ page bill meant to regulate the financial industry. Well, the bill that created the entire Federal Reserve was only 80 pages. So, you know, are we really looking at smart and sensible regulations, or are we going just maybe too far in our attempt to control the industry?
And also, you know, what was the goal of that behavior? It impacted. You know, I run a community bank. We don't use any derivative products. Most of the chances we take, we put on our own balance sheet. We didn't cause any of the foolishness in pre-08, but yet we're bound by arguably a lot of things that have only made our business more expensive, and if it makes us more expensive, that makes it tougher to serve communities that are not as profitable as others, which is, I don't think anybody wanted that benefit. And so that is and the other end of that spectrum, the CEO of Goldman Sachs actually said, let's make it as complicated as heck, because, you know, I got the staff to figure it out. So bring on
And
regulation.
the small banks.
And the small banks are taking the
Exactly.
burden
That's
of this
right.
regulation, and they didn't cause the problem.
Well, there hasn't been. I mean, you look here in North Carolina, and I know a lot of people in the banking community. In fact, one of my good mentors actually started Tri-Stone Community Bank many years ago. But that was started probably.
Wonderful man and a wonderful banker.
Yeah, exactly.
And a great Wake Forest.
He is.
Skip Brown
Skip
we're talking
Brown
about.
is who we're talking about. And now Skip started Tri-Stone roughly around 2003, 2004. That was one of the last banks to start in North Carolina. And the real reason for that is because this heightened sense of regulation. And so if you're a bank under the size of $1 billion, I mean, it makes it very difficult to compete in today's market. So you see massive consolidation happening in the small bank market. That reduces options for consumers. And again, I think, and you still take in consideration Dodd-Frank isn't still fully implemented. They haven't still fully gotten through the bill.
That's scary.
And
That
I
is
mean,
really
I think
scary.
they're maybe 2/3 through the way based on what I hear. So there's still a lot coming out of that bill. So
There's another, I think, interesting or pertinent point in Dodd-Frank is it's like most regulation, it's reactive rather than proactive. And the political pressure comes when there's been a problem, and there was a problem, and there was political pressure. Congress reacted with this massive bill, and now the industry's got to implement it, and it was all backward-looking rather than forward-looking. And it seems like every layer that gets put on is a little bigger than the previous layer.
And it never goes away.
Yeah, and I was going to say, and there's no sunset provision. There's no political incentive for any politician to say, "Gee, we need to revise this regulation," because by the time you get to that point, the political pressure from the public's off. They're on to the next problem and saying, "Hey, we need to react to this." And
It wasn't just the banks. You know, it was the individuals borrowing the money. It was the government. Everybody was engaged in this activity. Exactly. But it's all coming down on the banks, so that's not a real fair way to do it.
And once it's passed, they have to live with it, and you know it'll be there probably forever.
Well, and we're not an attractive. I mean, I say we as bankers, we're not an attractive political group to try to help. You know, that's one thing that you know, I have a broad spectrum. Well, I have a broad spectrum of friends, all the way from extreme left to extreme right, and I don't have many people that are waiting in line to say good things about bankers. But, and here's the but that I try to get out. You know, our entire way of life in this country rests on top of having a free, fair, and efficient financial system. And we cannot have that without healthy banks. It's just impossible to make that argument without healthy banks.
That's absolutely true.
And I just to add on there, but I still feel like and he alluded to it just a moment ago, I still feel like we haven't dealt with the real issue that caused the entire crisis, which is that we have a massive number of people in this country and in this state that are financially illiterate and are not able to make good choices when it comes to money, whether it's about saving or choosing the right kind of products to use when it comes to financing your home and your car, or whatever it may be. Yes, there were a lot of financial companies that were culpable in what happened and certainly put products out there that they shouldn't have been out there. We can argue that the government didn't necessarily have the right kind of roadblocks and speed bumps in place in order to slow down some of these financial companies. But I don't think you can ignore the fact that 4 out of every 10 Americans are financially illiterate, meaning that they cannot balance a basic checkbook. And we still haven't addressed what I think is the true root cause, people being able to make good decisions with their resources and their income and being able to save money. And so I think until you address that, you continue to have a problem. And you can write a 2,000 page bill or a 3,000 page bill, but you're still never dealing with the root cause of the situation.
You also have the Federal Reserve that's mispricing money and creating any number of unknown bubbles to include the federal debt. We would not have $20 trillion in debt if it were not for the Federal Reserve, because nobody would buy that debt. And that's going to cause us, the next bubble's coming around, who's going to be blamed for that?
Exactly. Well, there are many public policy issues that impact business. So providing for a quality workforce, the kinds of skill sets you need to run your company. What about those as issues that impact business?
Probably one of the largest problems we have in the future. If you look at whether it's IT engineers or factory workers or any job that requires skill, we don't have enough people applying for those jobs. There's something like 5 million jobs in the U.S. that are not filled that require some level of skill. So the public school complex has largely failed our students, it's failed our society, and it needs to change. And so we have this recognition that we need to have public education, but the providers are not doing the job. So we need new providers that will educate the public and fulfill the intention of public schools.
And as you travel around, as you talk to groups about issues, do you find that in the companies you're investing in, are they finding the workers they need?
And that's what I was going to say. You know, we're a little different than Garland. We don't have the $800 million market cap quite yet. We're on the way. We're coming. Okay. All right. We're working there. And so we're still very small, very boutique. So we still get very hands-on with the deals that we do and the partnerships that we put together. And being in the restaurant space, it is incredibly challenging right now. Just to be able to find good people, you know, even at that introductory wage that we always talk about in the hospitality and restaurant space. And part of it is skill, but also part of it is what I see amongst the labor force, just a lack of desire. I mean, just a deterioration of soft skills, of just wanting to come to work and be there on time and do the things that are necessary to be successful. I see not only in the hard technical skills that I think are so important, but there's also been a deterioration in just soft skills in the labor force.
Yeah, in our skills, we emphasize non-cognitive skills, which generally in school systems are not emphasized. And essentially, those are the skills you need to exist in the marketplace, like you're saying. But also, if you look currently and futuristic, the level of skill for a job is going up dramatically. Everything is becoming more complex, Internet of Things, very complex equipment, and we are not preparing our students for that marketplace.
Well, it's another, at the other end of that spectrum is something that we see, is we have, there are very important businesses all across rural North Carolina where the owner of that business is getting to the point where they're thinking about the future. How are they going to monetize their investment? How is that business going to continue to operate in a place that needs those 5 jobs or 10 jobs? And there's nobody in the community with either the wherewithal, both intellectually, well, I won't say no one, but oftentimes it's very tough to find a match between someone intellectually and someone who can raise the capital. And if that person doesn't step forward, those are, you know, rural North Carolina is already under attack in so many different ways. The last thing it needs is over this next generation of folks who operate really good businesses. It did fine post-08 for them to dry up and not be able to stay where they are, and yet more things move to the metropolitan centers of North Carolina.
And I think we had a missed opportunity in 2008. You know, we did this very large stimulus package in 2009, somewhere near almost $800 billion. And I think we had an opportunity right then with that stimulus package to be able to start engaging massive retraining of the workforce. There is a real skill dislocation, as we've been talking about around the table. And if we could have addressed that coming out of the recession and started to work with people to get them retrained, there's a number of people out there that are not computer literate. You know, you take the energy industry, for example. A few years ago, I toured a new Duke Energy power plant, huge, massive power plant, and I walked around, and they toured me around for a few hours. And towards the end of the tour, they took me to they called the control room. And I remember asking them, you know, where are all the people? Like, there's this massive plant out here, but there's no people anywhere. And they took me in this control room, and they said, this control room runs the facility. And there's only about 50 people that actually work at the facility, and all they do is work in the control room, and the computer runs the facility with all the sensors and everything that goes on there. And so if you're not computer literate or you're not able to engage with that, it's hard for you to get a job. Now, in the oil and gas industry, we're going to create 1.3 million jobs over the next 15 years. But there's a massive skill dislocation out there, and a lot of people not qualified right now to be able to go into those jobs that are going to be available as a lot of those baby boomers start coming out of the oil and gas industry.
Dr. Bart Danielson from North Carolina State University has done demographic studies, and essentially what he says from the studies, if you put good schools, people will follow. So if you went into eastern North Carolina or anywhere in North Carolina and put really good schools or in the urban areas, people will move into those areas, and it's the way that you develop a community. When you don't have good schools, what happens, they move out of the community and they begin to degrade, which brings up the phenomenon that Richard's trying to express to us.
Well, you know, one of the dynamics of a fast-growing state like North Carolina is that we have been an attractive place for business. We've seen a lot of economic expansion. What are the challenges we face going forward, and why does the business community need to be involved in those discussions?
Well, the biggest challenge that the people of North Carolina face is, there are different numbers thrown out, but somewhere between 60 and 70% of our growth over the next 15, 20 years is going to be constricted to 2 counties, Wake and Mecklenburg. And no matter what your political philosophy is on how active should government be, there's no denying that the people of North Carolina have made a multi-billion-dollar investment in the infrastructure of rural North Carolina. Good hospitals, good roads, good water and sewer, and to not have any sort of plan on, do we really want all these folks and all this growth right on top of each other?
There's a propensity to try to grow government to solve problems, and the reality is government exasperates problems. Problems have to be solved in the community by individuals, by groups, and so when we turn them over to the government, we make everything worse, and then what do? We created more problems, and then we create more big government. It's a bad syndrome.
What do we know from history? What you've written about? How we make good public policy?
Well, I don't know that we can. I think we can learn more about how we've made bad public policy probably in recent years. But going back to something Bob just said, and thinking about our portfolio of small, again, they're small companies. They tend to be as small as 10 or 15 million in revenue up to maybe 200 or 300 million in revenue. And many of those companies are located in small towns. Many of them are not located in cities. And I think, I think that's the dynamic of the free market. If government can restrain itself and not over-regulate them, then I think there's plenty of dynamism out in these areas, and I think it can and will occur. But we just see so many of these companies wrestling with government regulation. I mean, obviously we went through a serious recession, and everybody's been, I think, disappointed with the vigor or lack of vigor in the recovery. But I think if you look around, it's really amazing in some ways that the American economy operates as well as it does, dragging the amount of regulation along with it. And if we could clean up some of that, and I don't mean get rid of the regulations that are really important, but if we could clean up some of the things that are just sort of barnacles on the bottom of the regulatory boat, I think we'd see a lot more dynamism in our economy, a lot more growth.
How do we get business leaders to talk to elected officials about these public policy matters?
Oh, wow. Now, I think business leaders are very much engaged. I mean, pick the organization, around the state that engages with our state legislature and goes down and visits and talks about these issues. I think, and you and I've had these conversations probably before, I think the opportunity for business leaders is to get more involved in actual elected politics. I think we do the Capitol Day visits, and we make the campaign donations, and we stay up to speed with what's going on. And I think business leaders routinely let their voice be heard. But at the end of the day, as all of us around the table knows, if you're not the one actually casting the vote, you're still not necessarily in the driver's seat. But we also get so many business leaders who say they just don't want to get involved with the mess of politics. And so I think that's the stage that we have to get to at some point. So a lot of our talented, smart, connected business leaders have to make that decision to actually get involved in elected politics.
What kind of crazy person would want to run for elective office, though?
I had a sip of that punch once, and I tell my friends it's a defective gene that runs in my family, and it showed up in my body one day. No, but if anybody's having any problems, if they'll just find their local branch of First Bank and come to it, we'll fix everything.
Bob, you're very actively involved in politics. Well, why? What's the reason?
Well, think about this. One of the things that small business does really well is develop people. So what do we do in politics? We say, well, everybody has to make a minimum of $15 an hour. Well, most small businesses cannot pay $15 an hour, and therefore we cut off this opportunity. So I'm involved to kind of mitigate the insanity of government, essentially.
And when you think about your banks and the branches all across the state, certainly you have relationships with local elected officials and others, but What do they need to understand better about your business that you don't feel they necessarily understand now?
Probably the biggest thing is to understand just how many regulations there are in place. And I hate to keep going back to regulation, but it seems to, I'm all about trying to find issues that join people together, because we can always find things that divide us. But one of the things I'm really concerned about this next generation is if you believe that your government will fail, it will. It is a self-fulfilling prophecy, and we are so lucky to have grown up in a country where most people take for granted that when they flush their toilet, it's going to flush. When they call 911, somebody's going to come. Not the bumper sticker issues that you talk about, but our government still actually works. I wish we would focus on the things that are drags on creating new jobs. I personally believe that big business is too powerful in our country, and to the detriment of small business. And I think you see that every time regulation is rolled out, big businesses say, bring it on. That troubles me. It troubles me when I hear politicians say that they're going to create jobs. Unless they're expanding DMV or you got growth in the county and you need more school teachers, that's really not your job.
It was a great conversation today. Thank you all very much for being with us today. I've enjoyed this working lunch.
Funding for Working Lunch is provided by the financial contributions of viewers like you. Additional funding is provided by First Bank, McGuire Woods Consulting, and Fidelity Investments. Working Lunch is a production of UNC TV in association with the North Carolina Free Enterprise Foundation.